Hello, I'm Ryan Bolin, and welcome to my This I Believe podcast. In 2015, I started my teaching career in inner city San Antonio because Memorial High School was one set of failing test scores away from being reconstituted. And so what that means is that all teachers would be released and then they reapply for their jobs. And that sounded like a challenge, and I was a single 23-year-old with energy to throw at that, so I did. I had enormous success in getting scores where they were supposed to be, and I learned to teach in a culture totally different from the one in which I grew up. But it was always clear that there was way more that needed to be done for that community in addition to getting a diploma, right? Now, the only silver lining in a district when it's going south is that the state is going to throw money at the problem. So we had this enormous tech budget. iPads and Chromebooks were one-to-one, subscriptions to online resources were plentiful, and the district even got access to Google VR headsets. But still, week after week, I saw how disengaged and honestly just put off by school these kids were. Because when your job is to convince 140 kids to care about studying English, you work really hard at reasons why it's so beneficial. And logic just didn't get it done, right? Eventually, I was just as disenchanted as they were, and I was feeling like no amount of English was going to help the community. We had all the tech, we had all the tools, we just weren't using them in the right way, right? So in 2019, after 5 years in education at two different schools, I did move to a second school eventually. I left the classroom and I became a software engineer. I had been disenchanted with the way we were doing school. I was studying in the evenings, learning Java and working on projects, and got better and better and better at it. And I was really just reading and completing any tutorial I could get my hands on. And then came the frustration. 3 years of tutorials, 3 years of projects really did nothing to realistically prepare me for what I was going to be doing when I got hired on as a software dev. Because the tutorials that I was using, they didn't cover writing tests or writing code at scale for millions of users or how to lock fraudulent banking transactions. And when I'm talking about these tutorials, I won't name any names, but I'm using high-end companies that are supposed to be workplace training. Like I'm paying for these, like hundreds of dollars, sometimes like close to $1,000 per course, right? Almost like you're taking a college class. But they just didn't cover any of the stuff that you actually do in the day-to-day as a Java developer. So I kept up by continuing to read online. I picked other developers' brains. I learned on the job. But there were still really no resources out there for me to become this world-class backend developer that I wanted to be, right? So when I was laid off twice in 2020, I was so burnt out, I couldn't even stomach the idea of going back to interview for another tech startup gig, and just all the work that I'd put in to now be out looking for a job for the third time in a year. I was just over it. So I made myself sit down for about a week and just think through what would you do? What would you do and what would you be if you woke up every day essentially affecting the change you want to see, right? And I realized I want to get rid of this thing I'm fed up with. I'm fed up with school and training being inauthentic, right? As a teacher, I'd sat through so many trainings myself, and I could see in school we were putting on giving lessons that weren't always real transferable skills, right? So if you look today, I'm a technical course developer at Ping. Ping Identity is an identity management company, and I'm clearly at FSU in the ISLT program and on my path to becoming an instructional designer. And so this semester, as I got to study in this course and in staff training, I became really infatuated with this topic of simulated learning, right? And so this was a concept that I had become familiar with when my wife was in school for occupational therapy in 2016, because a lot of her courses factored in a clinical environment, a mock environment, essentially, where you're going to, for better or worse, do the same stuff you would do at work, but in a less risky environment, right? So this idea is that you're taking a real world environment and you can practice, but you have lower stakes, and that's simulated learning. And so much like my student teaching, she completed field work, and you're supervised in the setting to demonstrate to the university that you will be a competent occupational therapist or a teacher, right? So this leads me to what I believe. I believe that simulated learning, much like what my wife and I have experienced, should become commonplace. but I think we should also work very hard to increase its quality and its efficacy. In the trades and in medical fields, simulated environments are created all the time because those fields are more readily accommodating for that type of thing, right? You can weld in a classroom and teach a student basically how to do that in the environment that they'll later work in, right? If you teach a nurse how to intubate a patient, you can do that on a dummy, and even though it's not the exact same thing, it's pretty close, right? It's enough for you to get the idea of it, and then you start attempting it in real life, but you're not totally inexperienced at that point. So another thing that I learned about that ties into this is this idea of near and far transfer, right? So like welding instruction and intubating someone, those are great examples of like you can do it in the classroom and it will look almost identical in the real world or the job site or whatever you want to call the actual working world, right? But then there's this concept of far transfer, which feels more like the English classroom. This is where the learning environment isn't an exact replica of the working world. Like you may learn how to create sentences and structure them and put them in paragraphs, but the classroom isn't necessarily going to look like the job you have later that makes that work, right? And so when I learned about this, I had some new terms for what I was feeling in teaching and in software, because nothing was prepping me or my students for going out there and making money and living life and making sure that our people were taken care of, right? We had this feeling of like, I felt I couldn't keep up at work. They had this ever looming end of course exam. So I believe that simulated learning can not only help those needing to learn constantly changing high-tech skills like I needed, but I think it can also help students by assessing them and teaching them in more authentic ways, right? And I love that. I love authenticity. I love the idea that what you're studying makes you better at what you do. I think everybody loves that, right? So today when I'm prepping a course at Ping, let's take an example like MFA, right? Multi-factor authentication. I don't want to build a slide deck and hand you that. We've been there and we've done that, and those are great for overviews. They're great for sales meetings. We're just showing a little bit about the product, but they do very little when it comes to installing it and connecting it to your company's technology. I want to build a lab. I want a Docker container. And if you don't know what that is, it's just a way for you to download a fully fledged app that I've already built. I want you to pull down that lab environment and it walk you through connecting Ping's MFA tools to a real life app, right? Because while I can't come to your workplace and go through your app and learn it and teach you how to plug in that exact application, I can at least shrink that gap in transfer, right? I think the same thing can happen with testing, because just like how you're going to learn the APIs and the tools you need to go make our stuff work in your app, we can do the same thing with testing. Take the English to EOC test, the end of course exam. In it, you have to write a persuasive essay in which they're going to give you a topic like which is better, a big city or a small town. And you'll have 26 lines of essentially a sheet of notebook paper, and you'll have to write down a persuasive argument on which you think is better. Now, we could get into, well, what if you've never lived in a small town or a big city? What if, why are we teaching students to argue without sources? But I think it's really more about how inauthentic that writing is, right? Never in my career outside of the classroom have I had to write something as shallow as that piece of writing, right? Now, I've used persuasion, which is a real world skill, to try to get a raise. I've used that to write a grant proposal. I've used that to convince kids to keep going when they think they just can't keep doing it at school, right? In each of those, I needed persuasion, I needed evidence, argumentation. I needed to know how to structure all that. But here we are with a paper box and a pencil arguing over a preference, right? So I think this is where that simulated learning comes into play. Why don't we structure lab environments in which students ask for raises, they write proposals for things they want. It could be as simple as convincing me to go to their favorite restaurant, or as big as a scholarship application. How much easier would it be to learn geometry in a wood shop or robotics where the math that you're doing actually affects what you're creating? I've seen simulated learning applied, and it's made for the most active, engaged, and memorable lessons. That's how my robotics team got to state. We got second place, but they hadn't even gone to regionals before we started doing the trial runs and the test builds, right? I think it's going to be tough when it comes to things like inferencing that are more abstract. But I want to see more academic progress put into this so that whether it's a VR headset or a person in a test kitchen, simulated learning's out there working in the real world. Thanks for listening to my new fascination.